Davis, founder and CEO of Black Bourbon Society. And we are here for a very special masterclass with co-founder of Slane Whiskey, Alex Conyngham. So I'm going to bring him in. We're going to learn all about the history of Slane, especially the Slane Castle, and dive into a little bit about Irish whiskey. So, hi, Alex. Glad to have this.
How you doing, Samara?
Good.
Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have this very special masterclass with you. I am a big Irish whiskey fan and wanted to share this with our audience. You know, we're the Black Bourbon Society, so but most of our members in our audience do drink more than bourbon. So time to expand their knowledge base.
Right. Well, absolutely, let's do that. And of course, there are some really interesting ties between Irish whiskey and bourbon, which we can kind of get into as well as we explore, you know, the history of the category, where it came from, the highs and lows it's been through, and of course, where it's heading now and the different types, etc. So yeah, lots to delve through. Irish whiskey has been around for hundreds of years. It's one of the oldest categories out there. And at one stage back in the 18th and the 19th century, it was the category. It was the biggest spirits category in the world. And various things have happened since then. But it's probably fun to start with the word. And I'm sure a lot of your members will already be aware of this. But the origin of the word whiskey actually comes from the Gaelic, which is Uisce Beatha. And Uisce Beatha actually just means the water of life in Gaelic. So before, you know, we had refrigeration to keep our food fresh and everything else, food was a little unreliable in bygone days. And so you would actually take a shot of strong distilled alcohol after consuming food. And it also, it kind of acts as a natural antibiotic. It would kill off any infection in the stomach. And that's why it became known as the water of life, because it stopped you getting sick. And this is why in other cultures you find l'eau de vie, or aquavit, or in Irish and Scotch, it's Uisce Beatha. And that word Uisce became anglicized over time, and that's actually where the word whiskey comes from. And that ties all whiskey together, including bourbon. So that's a kind of a fun little nugget as to where it started. And of course, there's a lot of arguments about whether it was ourselves, the Irish, or whether it was the Scotch that actually started it. And depending on, you know, the oldest licensed distillery is in Ireland, but of course the art of distilling goes way back when, and it really came out of monks who were traveling east, and they picked up the art of distilling perfume and basically brought that back home, and I guess figured out that it was it could also be made to make alcohol that you could consume. So it really originated with the monks, and then it spread from there. But modern day whiskey really comes from taking this beautiful clear spirit, which you then of course put into wood. And it was putting in the wood where all of the color and the flavor and everything comes from. That's how you got from the traditional Uisce Beatha to the whiskeys that we know today.
So I want to dive into a little bit of the difference between the origins of the story, if you don't mind, like the Scottish and the Irish whiskey. Like, I have read conflicting information, especially when it comes to dates. Who do you think did it first?
I think in terms of who actually started whiskey, you've got to remember that in terms of land separation between Ireland and Scotland, if you travel a few hundred miles north of where I am right now in Slane, you're in Northern Ireland there, and you can actually, on a clear day, you can see Scotland. So the bridge is very narrow between the two, and there was always movement going on between them. And the monks who started the art of distillation and brought that back from the East and started brewing and distilling amongst themselves, there would have been a lot of movement in between. It's when you get into the legalization or licensing of it. So, you know, there's a distillery in Northern Ireland licensed to 1608. It's hard to beat that, but there are previous records on both sides that talk about whiskey or Uisce Beatha going back much further. But as I said, the critical thing is really when it started becoming or transitioning from a clear, strong probably fairly roughly made liquid into something that was stored in barrels and then mellowed and matured and took on additional flavor. That's really the birth of whiskey versus Ishkabaha. And that is kind of undefined. And look, we can argue until the cows come home about who started it. I guess the important thing is maybe how we're a little bit different from each other now and how those categories have evolved over time. And so, you know, the Irish whiskey rules over time have evolved into a big long document called the Irish Whiskey Technical File, which is like the playbook. And you would have these rules for American whiskey, of course. And that says it covers everything from the mash bill, the distillation, the fermentation stages, and basically each stage of the process and the rules which you have to adhere to, but also allowing enough scope for flexibility to bring in innovation. And I think that's a really important part of where Irish whiskey is going in the future, and certainly a big part of what we do here in Slane.
So let's go back. We talked about the origins of whiskey, whether it was, you know, it was clearly transported back and forth by the monks. The monks are the ones that originated it, we could say. Let's talk about the origins of Slane itself. So can we talk about the history of Slane Castle and the distillery?
Yes, of course. So, you know, we originate as a brand. So I'm currently standing in a beautiful building, which is actually our family home. So I live upstairs, so to speak. And it's great having our own bar in the place. But our family home is called Slane Castle, and it sits in a very beautiful part of Ireland called the Boyne Valley. Now, the Boyne Valley would have been a haven for distilling back in the 1800s and 1900s. The reason for that is twofold. Firstly, we have this beautiful river called the River Boyne, and the River Boyne is set in a limestone base rock valley. So rain falls on land. We get plenty of that in Ireland. And as it falls on the land, it's going to pick up just a little bit of minerality by the time it gets into the river. And so these distilleries were able to tap into that perfect water source for making whiskey. So nice and soft with a touch of minerality, which is really important for the yeast when it comes to the fermentation stage in terms of giving you flavor notes. So that's the first reason. Second reason, Boyne Valley produces some of the best cereals in the country. We've got wonderful farmland here, and my family is lucky enough to own 1,500 acres around the castle, and we are a farming family. So one of the reasons myself and my dad, Henry, who I started the Slane project with, the reason we got into it is because we were growing barley anyway. And we were growing that really for the feed market, where you're effectively a price taker. You really have no control over that. And we love drinking Irish whiskey. We enjoyed the category. And we basically said, look, you know, why the hell are we giving it away to the feed market when we could be adding the value on site and turning in something which we love, which is Irish whiskey. And that was one of the reasons we got into it. And that's why back in the 1800s and 1900s, there are actually a lot of distilleries in the Boyne Valley. And so Slane Distillery is bringing the art of distillation back to the Boyne Valley. So Irish whiskey, you know, declined substantially from its peak in the sort of 1900s, mainly because we got hit by Prohibition in America, which was our #1 market. But we also had something called the economic war with effectively the UK, because we had been under British rule and Irish whiskey had sold throughout the British Empire. And when we lost, you know, when that situation changed, that market effectively was shut out of that market. And those two things kind of combined, and Irish whiskey not quite disappeared, but we went down to a very small number of distilleries, down to 2. And now Irish whiskey is enjoying a massive resurgence, and we are now one of close to 30 distilleries. So Irish whiskey is enjoying, along with all whiskey categories, including bourbon, a real growth. And that's because people are looking for flavor. So myself and Dad, about 10 years ago, we started looking at this project, and building a distillery is no mean feat, but you know, we had the raw materials. Slane Castle is an extraordinary place. I grew up in this building, and I grew up really, I came out of in some ways out of the music business, because our main business as a family is using our grounds here in front of the castle to host big outdoor music festivals. So back in 1981, when my dad took over from my granddad, Ireland was going through something called the Troubles, which was a period of political strife, economic challenges, and Dad figured out that the only way to get this place back on track and to bring in the income was in those difficult times to throw open the doors, welcome people in, and bring them together through music. So he put on a festival literally in the front garden, and that festival attracted probably about 20,000 people. A band called Thin Lizzy headlined that first show, and a little-known act called U2 were just starting out, and they were on the support bill. They then formed a friendship with Dad and with Slane, and they lived with us for a few years in the building and recorded an amazing album called The Unforgettable Fire. And in 1982, Dad managed to persuade Mick Jagger to bring the Stones, and the Rolling Stones arrived in 82. And this time it wasn't 20,000 people, it was well over 80,000. And we've now been doing those gigs for close to 40 years. And that put us on the map. But we recognized that we needed to diversify, because my family, the Conynghams, have survived here through diversifying. And, you know, I'm not here just to protect this for my family. I want to protect Slane and its 1,500 acres and its biodiversity rich environment, its beautiful landscape and the built heritage that we have. And I see Slane whiskey as helping us to do that. So diversifying from the music and I guess the farming into whiskey just made a lot of sense. Plus, I'm very passionate about Irish whiskey. I love this stuff. And this is why I'm enjoying, you know, the chance to actually delve into perhaps the different types of Irish whiskey. We can go into that and explore a little bit more detail and a bit of education on what the Irish category actually is.
Yes, let's do that. Let's just talk a little bit more about the Irish category. I know that we'll dive in a little bit deeper, you know, into flavor notes and tasting notes on another session. But let's talk about Irish whiskey. What makes Irish whiskey? What are its characteristics, and how is it different from other whiskeys?
Sure. So firstly, there are different types of Irish whiskey. Many people will probably certainly know Irish whiskey from the blends, which would be your kind of mainstream Irish whiskeys, and that accounts in terms of volume and sales for the bulk of the category. And I would describe those whiskeys as generally very approachable, smooth, easy drinking, and Slane does play in that space with our existing product, which is our triple cask blend. And in another session, we can deep dive into that and the tasting notes. But when we were designing the distillery, we wanted to be able to do more than just the blend, because Irish whiskey is bigger than that. There are more types of whiskey. So just running through the different types, there are effectively 3 different types of whiskey that you can make. Now, if you were to cross the Irish Sea and go to Scotland, you're generally going to find a distillery that is a malt distillery. So that'll make malt whiskey, which is generally made in pot stills. It can either be double or triple distilled, and it uses one ingredient, raw material, being malted barley, 100% malted barley, and then obviously they use the water and the yeast. So we do make that style of whiskey here in Ireland. So at Slane, we actually believe in triple distillation. So we have 3 beautiful copper pot stills. And what I would say about Slane is our approach is about respecting everything that's good about Irish whiskey making tradition, but we want to layer it in with innovation. So, you know, we're always acknowledging the past, but we're not stuck in the past. We want to be progressive at the same time. So our triple distilled malt, our pot stills, they came from Scotland. They are 100%. They're hand-beaten copper. So you might find hybrid stills or other stills or copper nickel. We wanted to go old school, so hand-beaten copper, and they are works of art, and I was personally involved in designing them. And they sit in these beautiful buildings that date from the 1750s, which are the old stable yards and farmyard buildings of Slane Castle. And we resurrected and brought these buildings back to life, gave them a new sense of purpose. And 50 years ago, those buildings were employing stable hands and carpenters and blacksmiths and everything else. And now, once again, we're employing local people, adding value to farm produce, and ultimately sending Slane whiskey around the world. So triple distilled malt is our first whiskey. And I said there were 3. So the second one is unique to Ireland. It is only made in Ireland. and it is something called pot still whiskey. Now, pot still obviously alludes to the type of still that we use, but crucially, the mash bill is different from single malt. So single pot still whiskey, it's primarily barley focused. So you've got to have your malted barley in there, and you need that for the enzymes to convert the starch into sugars. But what's interesting is that it includes unmalted barley. Now, this is barley that can come straight off the field. It's dried and it's stored. And in fact, we're just recently, we would have harvested, we typically harvest our winter barley, which provide that component in kind of late August. So that's now stored locally, and we bring it in we bring it into the distillery as we need it. So that makes Slane a little different in that we are actually growing some of our own raw material right here on site. So the unmalted barley component, which you combine with the malt and then run through the pot stills, produces something called pot still whiskey. And the introduction of unmalted barley does a couple of things. It takes the whiskey longer to mature, but it's worth it, because what you do is you get a spicier whiskey and a really lovely creamy mouthfeel. And as it gets older in the wood, it'll develop some lovely kind of dried fruit notes. So we are making pot still whiskey at Slane, but it's going to take a little while before we're ready to release that. And pot still whiskey arose in Ireland because of something called the malt tax, which came in the 1780s. And effectively, Irish whiskey was selling all over the world, but the government of the day wasn't extracting any value, because they couldn't get it on the exports. And so they tried to figure out a way to get more money out of the distillers in Ireland. So they came up with a bright idea of taxing the inputs, i.e. every ton of malt that came into the distillery, you had to pay a tax. Now, the Irish, being pretty cute as they are, said, well, it would be nice if we didn't have to pay quite so much tax on this. So they started playing with the introduction of unmalted barley to see if it would work. And they didn't entirely understand why at the time. But actually, not only did they find that it worked, but it actually produced this different flavor profile and a different type of whiskey. And that's where pot still whiskey took off. So if you wanted to say like the native or the original or unique Irish whiskey style, it is pot still. And that will be coming out of Slane. And over the next 10 years or so in the US and in other markets, you are going to see single pot still becoming the Irish equivalent to, in my opinion, to the Scotch single malt category. And it's beautiful whiskey. There are already some out on the market, and I would recommend you trying them. So Slane, our pot still's coming, but you have to wait. So that is pot still whiskey. And the last whiskey, the third type, is called grain whiskey. Now, grain whiskey would have similarities with American whiskey. Not all American, but a lot of American whiskey is distilled in column stills. And column stills, basically, rather than being a batch process, they are a continuous process where you're injecting steam and you're basically stripping the alcohol out and taking it off at a high proof. Now, we like to do things a little differently in Slane as well. So firstly, in grain distillation, you normally have two principal columns if you're in Ireland. One is called the analyzer and the second one is called the rectifier. Now, the problem is Slane Castle is protected up to the hilt, as are the buildings that we put our distillery in. So if you are to build normal column stills, you're talking like 8-9 stories high. There was no way we're going to get away with that. So we actually split each of the two columns into 3. So we have a total of 6 column stills on site. And we can also adjust the takeoff point. Not only that, but we also believe in using Irish ingredients. So we are using, a bit like pot still, we're using a combination of malted and unmalted barley, running it through the column stills and using that to produce a grain whiskey. And that grain whiskey tends to be, it's lighter in character than either pot still or malt, but it's a beautiful blank canvas when you put it against the wood. And most Irish whiskey blends will have a significant proportion of grain whiskey in them, and then they can be combined with either pot still or malt whiskey or both. And that's what an Irish whiskey blend is. So blend, you're mixing it up and putting them together. So that means in Slane Distillery, we can make not only 3 different types of whiskey, but basically an endless combination of the 3. So I wanted us to be versatile over time, but we just got our single SKU at the moment. but we're in this for the long term. And I guess the other thing that makes us a little different is that although we're a smooth and approachable whiskey, and we'll get into this in more detail, I wanted us to put flavor first. So we are big, bold, robust, but still easy drinking. And that's going to cover all of the whiskeys that come out of Slane, both today and for the future.
So final question, we talked a lot about the history of whiskey, the history of Slane, and the technique of the expression that you have. Let's talk about a little bit more about the future of Slane. Where are we headed? What's coming down the pipeline for the distillery?
So right now we have resting in our warehouses, we've got all three types of whiskey that are just maturing beautifully. So I think given the success and enjoyment that people are getting out of our core blend, which again we'll get into tasting in more detail, we effectively took or dialed up the flavor on that by investing a little bit of extra time and frankly money in the type of barrels that we use. So because we are part of Brown-Forman, which is the only whiskey company in the world that actually make their own barrels, that gives us unique access to barrels that other distilleries maybe don't have. And so there are three different barrels that we use: virgin, American oak, seasoned American, which means they are ex-American whiskey barrels, and then finally we use an Oloroso sherry cask. And those three barrels, which we mature our whiskey in separately and then bring them back together, have basically made Slane a very kind of flavor-heavy whiskey, which was our ambition. So I think in terms of what's coming next, we're going to start diving into those barrels individually and maybe saying, how could we tweak or dial up or dial down one of those in particular? Because we do a deconstructed tasting here in Slane Distillery, where we actually give people the opportunity to taste each of the components separately. And the learnings that came out of that were like, people were saying, my God, this sherry, for example, this is an amazing liquid. So I kind of thought that got us going, and we thought, well, maybe it'd be fun to start playing with the proportions and maybe produce some variations on the blend. So we're certainly looking at that. And then, of course, waiting in the wings are our pot still and our single grain whiskeys, which are going to need a little bit of time because we'll never release anything until it's ready. So the Irish whiskey rules are 3 years in wooden casks, but we ain't going to release it at 3 years if it's not ready. It'll be ready when it's ready. If there's one thing you need in the whiskey game, it's patience, and so we need to give it the time. It really needs to come right. So I would say, yeah, variations on the wood is certainly something we're looking at, and then our single grain and our pot still are going to come down the track as well.
Excellent.
And then I suppose the other thing to add on that is, because we are growing part of our own raw materials like our barley, I think we got plenty of scope for innovation and kind of getting into the terroir of how that barley is produced, in terms of the soil types it's in, the varieties of barley. So I think that's an area where we're going to bring in some further innovation as well, because there are some really interesting heritage strains that may not give you the same level of yield, but they have really interesting impacts on both flavor and intriguingly also biodiversity, because older varieties, for example, are much longer strawed, and there's life that lives in that crop that doesn't do as well in the modern hybrids.
Well, we're definitely going to talk more about the biodiversity and also the sustainability in our next session.
Yes, we are.
I want to say thank you so much. This is part 1 of our masterclass with Alex Conyngham of Slane Distillery, and we'll see you on our next segment. So cheers, guys.
Thanks very much, folks.